Hello and welcome to another TLDR US video. The election is less than a week away, and as such, panic in both camps is running high. Normally, polling would put such discomfort to rest for at least one of the parties. But this year, even though Democrats appear to be ahead in the polling by some significant margins in swing states, many seem hesitant to trust those numbers. We made a video addressing the reliability of polling a couple of months ago, but with the election looming large on the horizon, we figured now will be a good time to revisit that subject, particularly the issue of a potential repeat of 2016, since that seems to be the underlying discussion in any conversation about polling. If you think that you know better than the pollsters, then enter the TLDR Route to 270 competition. Submit your predicted election map, and if yours matches the reality, then you'll be entered into a draw to win over $100 of TLDR prizes, including exclusive items. And because we're a British company, we'll also be adding in some British snacks and treats. For your chance of winning, click the link in the description and submit your guess. Terms and conditions apply. Entries close on Friday at midnight Eastern. Good luck. So, first things first, let's take a look at the simple facts of 2016. In the weeks leading up to the election, the RCP polling average had Hillary Clinton up by 3.2 points, and in the end, she won the popular vote by 2.1 points. Put simply, the national polls weren't actually off by that much. End of story there. But that's the thing, isn't it? Elections aren't decided by the popular vote. They're decided state by state in the Electoral College. That's obvious to mention now, but it was less of an issue in 2016. After all, it had been 16 years since the last election that saw the popular vote winner lose in the Electoral College. So, with the benefit of hindsight, let's just throw away the national map for the rest of the video. State polling, though, is where things get a tad sketchy in 2016. To be clear, state polls are generally off by a bit more than national polls. This isn't just a 2016 thing, and this comes from a number of places. Sometimes it's the quality of pollsters within the states that throw off the numbers. Sometimes it's the infrequency of polling, and sometimes it's any number of other miscellaneous factors coming together. However, this isn't to say that 2016 had the same level of polling error as past elections. In 2012, for example, 538 found that state polls were off by an average of 3.4 points, and that error often skewed in favour of Romney, not Obama, leading to predictions that tended to underestimate Obama's chances of re-election. In 2016, this state error expanded, but in the opposite direction, with the polls being off by an average of 5.4 points, generally underestimating Trump. So what caused this jump in error? In one word, education. The 2016 election was very split along educational lines. As a general rule, the more education you had, the more likely you were to vote for Clinton. And pollsters largely failed to notice or account for this. Good polls tend to weight varying characteristics and demographics, so as to make sure the poll is representative of the state they're trying to represent. For example, if you are polling a state and your sample was 90% men, you get a wildly misrepresentative result. Pollsters were fairly good at waiting for the more obvious demographic characteristics, like race, age, and gender. But education seems to have slipped under the radar. As such, many polls ended up underrepresenting voters without a college education, a segment of the population that swung decidedly for Trump. This issue was largely caused by the fact that less educated voters tend to be less likely to respond to pollsters in the first place, making the divide in data quite stark. And in states like Michigan, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania that each went for Trump by less than a point, this educational polling mistake was enough to create the false image that Clinton was doing better than she actually was. Trump's small margins in these states is also one of the biggest reasons that the popular vote electoral college split is so massive. He only won those three states by combined about 110,000 votes. But those 110,000 votes translated into 46 electoral college votes, and ultimately swung the election. Anyway, there's also the issue of late deciders. Exit polls found that of those who decided in the week running up to the election, 45% went for Trump, compared to Clinton's 42%. This divide becomes even more noticeable when you extend it to those who decided in the month running up to the election. Trump won those voters by 8 points, which in an election decided by tiny margins is huge. On top of all this, Trump won independents by 4 points. Those three factors, education, deciding time, and independent swing, are among the three most important factors to understanding what confused the polls. So now that we understand what happened in 2016, let's see if that helps us understand 2020 any better. The most important changes in state polling this year came, unsurprisingly, in educational weighting. This year, most reliable pollsters are weighting by education, in an attempt not to end up with a sort of 2016 2.0 situation. So Trump voters are, by and large, likely much better accounted for in this year's polling than they were back in 2016. It also helps that there's much more focus on individual states now than there was before. Nearly anyone who pays close attention to the polls will be quick to point out the differences between a national poll's numbers and those in various states. Essentially, people are a lot more conscious of the role that the Electoral College could play this November. And that means that demand for high-quality polling is just much higher this year. That's a large part of the reason we're getting a lot of polls from good sources like Monmouth University and the New York Times Siena College polling. And then, of course, there's the issue of voting itself. Obviously, a lot more people are voting by mail this year than they did in previous elections. And while this is often talked about in terms of how long it will take to learn the results, it should also be noted that this could impact what's contained in those results. That's because, to put it simply, a lot of people have already voted. And with Biden polling above Trump in nearly every swing state, this is generally perceived to be bad for the president. After all, the more people that vote early, the less of a swing there can be in the final week, if something like a Comey letter occurs again at the last moment. Of course, this should be taken with a grain of salt. People who vote early are less likely to be undecided and more likely to be strong partisans. But you could even add a grain of salt to that grain of salt by pointing out that there are just fewer undecideds overall this year when compared to 2016. And it's the small details like this that keep the people trying to predict the election all tied up in knots. And obviously, we at TLDR are not in the prediction business. But we do know a few things from 2016, so let's take a look at those. Firstly, we know that the polling is better. Since educational weighting was by far the biggest issue with polls in 2016, we can assume that the polls are simply going to be more accurate this year. Are they still going to be off by a bit? Yes, but are state polling averages probably going to be closer to the actual result this year? That would definitely be a fairly safe assumption. Second, we do know that 2020 is seen very differently from 2016. There are fewer undecideds this year, and turnout will almost certainly be higher. It should also be pointed out here that, as we've discussed in previous videos, people's opinions on the candidates this year are much more straightforward than they were in 2016. In 2016, many people viewed Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump as being similarly unlikable. This year, Trump's Democratic opponent is fairly well liked by many, and viscerally hated in a way that Clinton was by very few. Trump, meanwhile, is still historically unpopular, which segues us nicely into the third thing we know. The 2020 presidential race is historically stable. One of the other reasons that polls in 2016 struggled was that the race was quite fluid, especially in the final month. Let's compare the RCP polling average chart from 2016, which we showed earlier in this video, to this year's. I know we said we wouldn't talk about national polls here, but the difference is definitely worth absorbing. You can even see the same thing in RCP's average from the 6 main swing states. And then there's Trump's approval numbers. Here 538 shows Trump's approval rating, the green line, in comparison to those of his predecessors, going all the way back to Truman. Trump's approval, you might note, is both astoundingly consistent and astoundingly low. Since consistency breeds consistency, this means we're less likely to see a significant swing that confuses the polls at the last moment. But now that we've spent the better part of 10 minutes telling you why 2020 is different, we should also note that this doesn't definitely mean that there'll be a different result this year. It is still well within the realm of possibility that Trump wins. All that this means is that it would take more than it did in 2016 for the polls to be wrong. Perhaps we'll have a different group making a surprising swing in Trump's direction this year. Or perhaps there'll be an issue with ballot counting. Or maybe we will indeed end up having another Comey letter-like occurrence in the last few days of the election campaign. But the clock is starting to run low for such shock events, and the longer the polls stay consistent, the more likely it is that Biden will win. Trump might not want to have a full-on panic attack just yet, but a worry might just be in order. What do you think though? Are you trusting the polling, or do you think that Trump could pull from behind? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, be sure to share your election map with us in the Route to 270 competition. The link to enter is in the description. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release more videos. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then be sure to back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.